Hello people, welcome to episode 9 of the Big Tent podcast by Circus Bazaar Magazine. I'm Alexander Caldwell, aka The Ringmaster. Earlier this year we were given the great privilege to have Serhiy Tomilenko, the President of the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, visit Circus Bazaar headquarters to discuss a variety of topics. He was on a mission across Europe to increase awareness of his and his organization's activities inside Ukraine, which fundamentally consist of the support for journalists in this time of war. Now, I'd heard a lot of good things about Serhiy prior to this interview, and he didn't disappoint. He was a great guy who was willing to speak openly on topics not only related to the conditions of journalists inside Ukraine, but also on topics of truth, freedom of expression, and press freedoms inside his own country at this time. We also discussed the topic of national sovereignty more broadly, of which he answered in Ukrainian. So we've printed this as a transcribed interview in the next print edition of Circus Bazaar Magazine, which coincidentally is entirely dedicated to the conflict in Ukraine at present. So for those that don't know, Circus Bazaar Magazine is now a biannual print publication that you may have delivered directly to your door. So if you support independent media, then please visit circusbazaar.com/shop and subscribe. So without further ado, I introduce to you Serhiy Tomilenko, the President of the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine. First of all, thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and it's a great pleasure. I've heard a lot of good things about you. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Serhiy Tomilenko, the President of the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, and we is the largest journalistic organization in Ukraine, and we try to support Ukrainian and foreign journalists in these war conditions.
What's happening in Ukraine at the moment is a war. Probably the most serious war on the European continent since World War II. And under those conditions, truth is something that gets completely obliterated, as I understand it. Can you give us your perspective on what does truth even mean under the conditions of war?
As we see, maybe the first stage of first phase maybe of this war is Russian propaganda, and we saw that because Putin isolated Russia and neutralized any independent media and only produce propaganda, so we see now that most of Russians, they support this war, and after first day when all world was shocked by these tanks, by shelling, and every Ukrainians we were shocked, and we hoped that next day this war will be stopped. But we see that Russia supports war, and the reason is propaganda, because it's creates new virtual reality which supports hot war. And truth, maybe truth or independent journalism or independent media for Russians or for tyranny is maybe is a weapon which can which is dangerous for Putin. And we saw on newly occupied Ukrainian territory that when Russians army controlled Zaporizhzhia, controlled Berdyansk, Melitopol, Kherson, or other cities, Next activities were attempts to stop any independent journalism or media, and Russians arrested Ukrainian journalists and demanded from them that they should be local propagandists or they should be silenced. And some of the shocking case was in Melitopol, where Russians arrested 75-year-old father of editor-in-chief Ria Melitopol, independent local digital media, and they arrested him, her father, and called to daughter and demanded that they can change father for daughter if she come to occupied Melitopol, and when she stopped produce truth news or some independent news. So we see that for Putin truth or independent views is dangerous, but only truth or some professional or independent information, it's important for Ukrainians, for fighting for freedom, for fighting for our future, because we don't want to be part of Russian world or part of Russia, so we should fight, and only truth or some truth and reliable information was good for us. But if we start to create only Ukrainian propaganda against Russian propaganda, it's not good way for us, because we not to build only anti-Russia, or maybe small Russia with only Ukrainian officials and guys who want to have tyranny power, but want not to be on the species of Putin.
Okay. Well, as I understand it, that war does destroy the truth, but there is a truth that exists, and the Ukrainian nation has been invaded by another country. And the role of misinformation is to demoralize or at least harm the target. Has that had an effect on the Ukrainian society? And if not, why do you think it hasn't?
No, yep, misinformation in this war supports occupies and we see that, for example, in Mariupol, when Russians occupied fully Mariupol, then maybe after 3 weeks they printed in Russia fake local media brand Priazovsky Рабочий newspaper as local Mariupol newspaper, and delivered it to local residents as verified local information that every resident in Mariupol support Russians, and Russia is the future for Ukraine, for Mariupol. So if people consume only misinformation or only ritual, this fakes or propaganda, so they can support this occupation, and we saw that how some Ukrainians received Russians ID in Kherson, in Kharkiv regions, in Donbass, and we see that misinformation is a weapon for Russians not only on Ukrainian territories, occupied territories, but in the whole world. And Russia tried to spread misinformation in Norwegian, in Western countries, in United States, everywhere where they can. They spread misinformation, and Russians, they demand press freedom for Russians media. But I, as Ukrainian journalist, and I am as president of our Ukrainian Union of Journalists, we think that press freedom is right only for that news rooms where freedom is. But if newsrooms are dependent from Kremlin or dependent from government, so they can demand freedom for them abroad.
Do you think the disinformation campaigns have had an effect on the international community?
Do you see it? Do I see it?
Yeah, do you see it? Or what do you think as a journalist?
No, we see that Russia produce some fakes and spread as on Russia-controlled media or state media, or try to use some journalists or freelancers in Western media. Russia organized special press tour to occupied territories, and I think that for this moment we see that most Western countries or democratic countries try to block Russia propaganda and block this campaign, and we see understanding that if governments not to stop such disinformation or misinformation campaigns from Russia, so Russian world will be here in this country. So I think that we see, and
but as a journalist that's representative of other journalists, you mentioned before that it's better to not counter Russian propaganda with Ukrainian propaganda. And so has that been a difficult mission, given the context of a war, from your perspective?
I want to say that if you compare most of Ukrainian national media, how Ukrainian journalists cover this war, with content of Western media, we see the same maybe picture. Only on some sensitive topics, but it's 10%, 5% of coverage, only on some very sensitive topic, Ukrainian media maybe are silent, but the most coverage is the same way. So I think that for this moment, Ukrainian propaganda is mostly some rules for officials, how they work, how they present some information or public relations, but it's not some censorship for media and how media should cover this war. But we see that we should fight for press freedom in our country because our parliament, our ruling party, want to have a big, powerful state media regulator which can regulate every media in Ukraine and work of every journalist, because new media law was supported in Ukrainian parliament, and next week Ukrainian big state TV and radio regulators can regulate and pressure on every print media and online media in Ukraine.
Media is a skill that not everyone is adept at, but your president, Zelensky, has a history of working in media. How do you think that has affected the information landscape, and has that been a powerful tool for Ukraine to counter the influence of Russian information?
Yep, Zelensky is one of the biggest media guy in the world, and his background is background of media media leader. But as we see, it supports to us, to Ukraine, in this situation, to collect some sympathy, to unite Western countries to Ukraine. But when we see in Ukraine, maybe because most of members of Zelensky team are people from media industry, they try to use knowledge about Ukrainian media landscape, and they try to control. They try how not to support media to be more independent, but maybe if media have big problems, so they will maybe not have to criticize government or others. So it's difficult question, because as we see in past, many Ukrainian journalists or some media figures who who decided for them to be in parliament. So in parliament they fighting with journalists and media. They not support press freedom when they became politicians in Ukraine.
So obviously there's been a digital revolution in communications over the last 20 years. One of the big questions is whether or not these technologies have eroded democracy and enhanced autocracy or unfree societies. How do you see that in your experience? Is that true, or is it a two-sided coin? Does the new information landscape enable us to criticize autocracy and expose wrongdoings, or is it all one-way traffic?
Oh, it's a complicated question, especially for Ukraine, because digital world is maybe world of free people who can connect, who can criticize, who are united in social media. But now we see that social cyber big tech company try to control such discussions and other, but I want to accent that in Ukraine, in this war realities, digital world is can influence on situation only if people can have access to internet and communication. Because we see on the occupied territories or frontline territories, on maybe one-third territories of Ukraine, Russians destroyed any communications, and we can discuss about digital in in Barcelona, in Warsaw, maybe in Kiev, but it's a third part of Ukraine. We can discuss about digital world because there are no electricity, no communications, and many Ukrainians they can't call, can't use mobile communication. So only media which can be presented on these territories is traditional media, traditional print newspapers as classical some information. So in this situation, we as union, we have big initiative and a big priority to support our colleagues, editor-in-chief and journalists from local media of the occupied and frontline territories to restart their newspaper, their media. And for this moment, we supported more than 20 such newspapers. Biggest is Norway from Kherson, and some newspapers which we supported are from Donbass, from Bakhmut, from Liman, and for this moment our colleagues who are inner refugees, who not live in destroyed the cities, but they can produce newspapers for local auditorium and residents, and such newspapers now are delivered by volunteers, by some soldiers, army, and the main media for many Ukrainians are such hyperlocal or local newspapers as only source of verified information, and such small newspaper is big weapon against Russian propaganda on these territories too. And digital is important, but on some territories, in some cases, we can compare situation as with First World War with 19th, but not with the future.
So what you're saying is that in times of war or when time gets tough, print media remains the backbone of information distribution?
No, yep. We see that print media have future, and I think that we should appreciate every type of media, digital, TV, radio, print media too. But we see that print media is very important for people, for consumers, and print media, as for me, is a resource more verified information, and people we fixed that trust to print media is higher than for other media.
I believe so too. Okay. Well, on that note, I think we finish it. It's 15 minutes now. It's a pretty decent time. Thank you so much for giving your time up. And, I think that I personally wish you all the best in coming time.